Becky lived in a quiet village, where almost everyone made ordinary red and blue beads. But Becky's creations were different. Her beads told stories. They bore unique patterns, colors that seemed to dance in the light, and shapes that no one had seen before. By night, under the soft glow of the moon, she worked by candlelight. She threaded bracelets, necklaces, waist beads, and even beaded bags that were so beautiful the villagers whispered about them in amazement. Yet not everyone admired her talent. Becky lived with her aunt, a woman who watched Becky's success with nothing but bitterness. Her heart was hardened by envy. She couldn't stand Becky's joy. She couldn't tolerate the admiration Becky received. And so, in one act of cruelty, she destroyed all of Becky's art. Every bead, every string, every masterpiece was pulled apart, shattered, and thrown into dirt. Becky was heartbroken. Her creative spirit sank as she stared at the wreckage of dreams she had poured her soul into. For a moment, it seemed as if her beautiful art had died right there in the dust. But fate had other plans. As the sun rose the next morning, something remarkable began to happen. The villagers, who had once watched from afar, awed by Becky's talent, gathered around her. They spoke of how her art had touched their hearts, how it had brought color into their lives, and how its loss weighed heavy on them all. Inspired by their encouragement, Becky began again. This time, something even more extraordinary emerged from her hands. Patterns more beautiful than before, colors more radiant than the sunrise, designs that seemed to sing news of her. Creation spread like wine through wheat fields. People traveled from distant places just to see the girl whose art had been cruelly destroyed, only to rise more astonishingly than before. And Becky, with a heart that refused to be defeated, became a legend in that village and beyond. Her aunt, left with regret, could only watch as Becky's brilliance shone brighter than ever. The villagers did not leave quickly that day. They stayed longer than usual, standing beneath the trees, bending closer to the cloth where the beads lay, lifting necklaces gently as though they might break if touched too roughly. Some whispered prayers under their breath. Others smiled without speaking. Children reached out and were gently pulled back by their mothers, not out of fear, but out of respect. Becky sat quietly among them. She did not boast. She did not explain her patterns. She simply watched as people saw themselves. In her work, colors that reminded them of seasons, shapes that echoed old stories, designs that felt familiar even when they were new. And from a distance, just beyond the circle of admiration, her aunt stood watching. The older woman said nothing. She did not join the group. She did not leave either. Her eyes followed every movement, every smile Becky received, every nod of approval, every hand that reached out to touch the beads with care. Something heavy settled in her chest. That night, the village slept under a sky thick with stars. But inside the hut they shared, there was no peace. Becky lay on her mat, awake, listening to the sounds of insects outside, the quiet breathing of her aunt nearby. Her hands ached from the day's work, but it was a good ache, the kind that comes from purpose. She closed her eyes and imagined new designs, new colors she wanted to try. Behind her, in the darkness, her aunt lay staring at the ceiling. The admiration had not faded when night came. It echoed in her thoughts. It pressed against her pride. She remembered a time when people looked at her that way, a time before life hardened her, a time she rarely spoke of. And instead of softening her heart, the memory sharpened something cruel. Before dawn, while the village still slept, she rose quietly. She did not light a lamp. She moved by memory, by resentment, by a certainty she had convinced herself was justice. She gathered the beads, all of them, the necklaces the villagers had admired, the bracelets still warm from Becky's hands, the unfinished designs resting carefully on the mat, and without hesitation, she destroyed them. Strings snapped, beads scattered across the dirt floor like spilled seeds. Some were crushed beneath her feet. Others were flung into corners, hidden under ash, mixed with soil until their colors dulled. By the time the first rooster crowed, nothing recognizable remained. When Becky woke, the silence felt wrong. She sat up slowly, and then she saw the floor. She did not scream. She did not cry immediately. She simply stared. Her breath came shallow as she knelt, gathering broken pieces with trembling hands, trying hopelessly to reconnect what had been torn apart. Her fingers moved faster, then slower, until they stopped altogether. That was when the tears came, quiet ones, the kind that fall without sound. By the time the village stirred, Becky had already swept the broken beads into a small pile and carried them outside. She sat beneath the same tree where the villagers had stood the day before and placed the fragments on the ground. People noticed. They came closer. They asked no questions at first. They saw the destruction. They understood enough. A murmur moved through the crowd, not loud, but deep, heavy, disappointed. Some looked toward the hut, others looked at Becky, and then something unexpected happened. An old woman stepped forward. She removed the beads from her own neck, simple ones, worn smooth by years of use, and placed them gently into Becky's hands. "These were my mother's," she said. "They are old, but they still remember how to be useful." Then a man came forward with dyed threads. Then a child offered a small pouch of beads he had been saving. One by one, people gave what they could, not out of pity, out of belief. The aunt watched from the doorway as the village rebuilt what she had destroyed. And for the first time, doubt crept in. Days passed. Becky worked again, but differently now. Slower, more intentional. She no longer worked only for beauty. She worked with memory in mind, with patience, with a quiet strength shaped by loss. Her designs changed. They became deeper, more layered. Each piece carried a story, not just of creation, but of survival. Word spread beyond the village. Travelers came. Traders stopped longer than planned. Some came only to see her work. Others stayed to learn. Becky taught them willingly. She hid nothing. And slowly, without ceremony, she became known, not just as a bead maker, but as someone whose hands healed what bitterness tried to ruin. The aunt grew quieter. The village no longer spoke harshly of her, but neither did they praise her. She lived among them, as she always had, but now, in the shadow of a truth she could not escape. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the hut's gold, she approached Becky. Her steps were hesitant, her voice unsteady. "I was afraid," she said finally. "Afraid of being forgotten." Becky looked up. She did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was calm. "Fear breaks things," she said, "but it doesn't have to." The aunt nodded, tears filling her eyes. And for the first time, she reached out, not to destroy, but to help. From that day on, she sat beside Becky. She learned. She listened. She carried shame, but she also carried change. And the village watched as bitterness slowly loosened its grip. Years later, people would still speak of the girl who made beads, but they spoke even more of what her hands taught them: that creation can survive destruction, that envy can be unlearned, and that sometimes the most powerful beauty is the kind that returns after being broken. And in the evenings, when the wind moved softly through the trees, beads would clink gently together outside a small hut still being made, still telling stories, still refusing to disappear. The lantern burned low as night settled fully into the village. The beads hanging outside the hut swayed gently, touching one another with soft, familiar sounds. It was not loud enough to wake anyone, yet not quiet enough to disappear. The village breathed around it, goats shifting in their sleep, distant crickets beginning their work, the faint murmur of a fire dying somewhere far off. Inside the hut, Becky sat still. She did not work her beads that night. She simply watched the light move along the walls, tracing the places where old cracks had once been ignored, now repaired. Her hands rested in her lap, warm, steady. The day had been long, full, different. Across from her, her aunt slept for the first time in many nights without restlessness. Her breathing was slow, uneven at times, but no longer sharp with tension. Regret had softened into something quieter, something closer to humility. Outside, the village moved gently into sleep, and in that stillness, something unseen but important settled into place. The next days passed with a new rhythm. Becky's hut was no longer a place people approached cautiously. It became a place of pause, a place where people stopped not only to buy, but to sit, to watch, to listen. Some brought questions, some brought stories, some brought nothing at all but stayed anyway. Children learned first. Becky let them handle beads, let them make mistakes, let strings tangle and colors clash. She did not correct them quickly. She remembered how patience had saved her. The aunt watched quietly at first, then she joined. Her hands were slower, rougher, shaped by years of work that had nothing to do with beauty. But she listened, she learned, and when she taught, she spoke softly, not with authority, but with care. The villagers noticed. They noticed how she stepped aside to let Becky speak. They noticed how she nodded instead of interrupting. They noticed how her eyes no longer hardened when praise was given. And slowly, very slowly, trust returned. One afternoon, a trader arrived from far beyond the village path. He carried cloth dyed in colors unfamiliar to most: deep indigo, burnt gold, soft ash white. He had heard of the beads, not their price, their meaning. He watched Becky work without speaking for a long time. Then he said, "These are not decorations." Becky looked up. "They are records," he continued. "They remembered." She smiled. That was the first time her work left the village not as goods, but as stories. Weeks turned into seasons. The rains came and went. The beads changed again, adapting, responding, growing with the world around them. Patterns began to reflect drought and abundance, grief and reunion, loss and repair. No two pieces were the same, and the ant, once the source of destruction, became the keeper of order. She guarded the beads at night. She organized threads. She corrected careless hands with gentle reminders. When people asked her how she learned it, she did not lie. I broke what I did not understand, she said. Now I protect what I nearly lost. There were moments Becky remembered the pain, moments when broken beads flashed in her mind. But those memories no longer ruled her. They informed her. One evening, long after the village had grown quiet again, Becky tied a finished necklace and held it up to the lantern light. It caught the glow and reflected it softly, not sharply. She handed it to her aunt. "For you," she said. The older woman stared at it for a long time before taking it. "I don't deserve this," she whispered. Becky answered simply, "That's why you'll keep it." Years later, elders would speak of that hut not as a place of beads, but as a place where something changed. They would say bitterness entered and did not survive. They would say talent was tested by cruelty and answered with patience. They would say the village learned that creation is strongest when it refuses to become what tried to destroy it. And even long after Becky's hands slowed with age, beads still hung outside that hut, clinking softly in the breeze, carrying forward a story that never needed to be shouted to be remembered. The beads continued to sway long after the village had gone quiet. Their soft clinking blended with the night sounds, the distant call of insects, the faint crackle of a dying fire, the hush of wind moving between huts. No one stood outside to watch them now, yet they moved as if remembering hands that had shaped them, stories they had already carried. Inside the hut, the lantern burned low. The older woman sat alone, the necklace resting against her chest. She did not sleep. She did not weep anymore either. Her tears had already done their work. What remained was something heavier, but steadier, a quiet acceptance. For the first time in many years, she allowed herself to remember not only what she had done wrong, but why she had done it. The fear of being replaced, the ache of feeling unseen, the bitterness that grew when silence was mistaken for strength. She understood now that pain, when ignored, does not disappear. It looks for somewhere else to live. And that night, she promised herself it would not live in her again. By morning, the village woke as it always did. Smoke rose slowly from cooking fires. Footsteps traced familiar paths in the dust. Children laughed without knowing why. The air felt lighter, only that it did. Becky stepped outside her hut and paused. The beads were still there, intact, whole, catching the first light of the day. She reached out and touched them gently, not to check if they were safe, but to feel their presence. They were no longer just hers. They belonged to the village now, to the hands that had rebuilt, the hearts that had forgiven, the silence that had taught them all. As days passed, people began to speak of the beads differently. They no longer asked only how long they took to make, or how much they cost. They asked what they meant. They asked where the colors came from. They asked who had touched them before. And Becky answered honestly. "These beads were broken once," she would say. They remember that. The older woman became part of the telling. She spoke to the children when Becky was busy. She showed them how to untangle threads patiently. She told them stories of mistakes not as warnings, but as lessons. And when people looked at her now, they no longer saw the woman who destroyed. They saw the woman who stayed. Years later, travelers would still come down the dusty path, drawn by quiet reputation rather than noise. They would sit beneath the trees and watch hands move with care. They would feel something settle inside them, even if they could not name it. And when night came, and lanterns lit one by one, beads would sway outside a small hut, and changed in form, but forever changed in meaning. Because some stories are not meant to end loudly, some are meant to continue softly, carried forward by patience, protected by humility, and remembered by the gentle sound of beads in the dark. And so the village slept, and so the beads remained. And so the elders say, be careful what you try to destroy when envy visits your heart, for what is built with patience carries a strength anger does not understand. The older woman learned this too late to undo her mistake, but not too late to change its meaning, because the village saw that night that harm does not always end a story. Sometimes, it reveals what must be healed. They learned that talent is not loud, and humility is not weakness, that hands meant to break can still learn to protect, and forgiveness does not erase pain, it transforms it. From that time on, whenever jealousy stirred among the people, they would point to the beads hanging outside the hut and say, those were broken once, they are stronger now. And whenever someone feared being forgotten, the elders would answer, what is shared does not disappear. What is guarded by love does not fade. So the beads remain not as decoration, but as a reminder that creation outlives destruction, that patience humbles pride, and that the quiet work of healing often shapes the strongest legacy of all. And that is why, even today, when beads are heard clinking softly in the night, the village listens, because wisdom does not shout, it stays.